I'm going to talk about who are the masters as a kind of introduction for this whole series that will be based on the theosophical teaching of the Mahatmas, or the masters, or the brothers as they were called in the Theosophical Society at the beginning of our organization. But today we are going to do just an introduction, and next week Tim will come and go on with this subject. He's going to talk about who the masters say they are, and probably he's going to base his talk on what we find in the Mahatma letters. The Mahatma letters are a correspondence that a couple of the masters had with some Englishmen, theosophists, at the beginning of the century. And it's a very interesting correspondence. We have the letters. The letters are kept in the British Library, and there is a lot of information there, and especially about many subjects, but also about who the masters are and what their characteristics and features is. To introduce this subject, we find in the Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism the idea that the soul is kind of chained to the physical world. The soul is within a physical body, an emotional nature, and a mental aspect. And this soul is chained, as I said, to a cycle of incarnation, of birth, death, rebirth, death, in a cyclic way. And one of or probably the main aim of the spiritual person is to get out of this cyclic incarnation and death, is to break through this cycle and get what is called liberation. The way it is described in Hinduism and Buddhism is that to be able to go beyond this cycle, we need to stop producing karma. The idea of karma is that every action generates a reaction. And we are in this cycle because we have produced karmic causes to come back to incarnation. So what traditionally they try to do is first to generate good karmic causes so that they get to a favorable birth, and then once you get to a favorable birth where you can practice spirituality, the idea is to stop producing karmic causes. So as you exhaust the previous causes and you don't produce new ones, you will get liberated from this cycle. So because of this idea in Hinduism, sometimes people interpret this as we have to stop doing things because every action produces karma. So there is a tendency to produce a kind of passivity. The people become passive and they don't want to act so that they don't produce any karmic cause. But the Bhagavad Gita and many other books, Hindu books, say that it is impossible to stop doing something because the very fact that we think and we feel is also an action. It's not a physical action, but it's an emotional action or mental action. Anyway, the idea is that by getting rid of the karmic causes, we can get liberation from this cycle. Now, when the Theosophical Society was founded, a new concept was introduced in this idea, and this is the concept of evolution. What Theosophists said is that this cycle has a purpose. that the purpose is to produce an evolution, both at the level of our souls and at the level of our bodies. So that it wasn't enough just to stop producing karmic causes. What we need to get liberation is to fully develop our spiritual nature, to fully develop our capacities, our understanding, because that is why we come once and again to the physical life. At the beginning, as any other new idea or relatively new idea, this idea of evolution was resisted. But eventually, later, Buddhists and Hindus, like for example, Aurobindo, he's a Hindu that started talking also about evolution after Blavatsky. And today, in Hinduism, it's a concept that many accept. And in Buddhism, the concept of evolution, I don't think is very prominent. But anyway, this concept of evolution has a very interesting connotation. Because if there is an evolution, a spiritual evolution, that means that we human beings are not necessarily the last product in this evolutionary cycle. Why would we think that we are the crown of creation? This process of evolution goes on, and human beings get to a point where, from a certain point of view, they are beyond humanity, beyond what a normal human being is. When Blavatsky and the early theosophists started talking about this, in the West, there was not a clear idea about, or a knowledge about, the concepts of enlightenment or the knowledge of any enlightened beings. In the West, we knew about saints, mystics, but we didn't have the concept of what an enlightened being is, which today is much more known. This concept of enlightenment means that a human consciousness realizes truth, and with this realization of truth is free from the cycle of birth and rebirth, but also attains a kind of absolute wisdom. When Blavatsky started talking about the masters or the Mahatmas or the brothers, as they were called at the beginning in the Theosophical Society, she was talking about enlightened beings, which are the natural product of spiritual evolution. So, as I said, at that time, it was difficult for people in the West to understand this concept of enlightened beings. When the Theosophical Society was founded, the spiritualistic movement was very strong, and there were mediums that had what they used to call the spirit guides, which were supposed to be spirits of people that had died. And the concept was that once a person dies, suddenly, for some reason, acquires a wisdom that that person didn't have on the physical plane, and then they could become guides of the mediums. So when Blavatsky started talking about these enlightened beings, that she knew that she was trained by these enlightened beings, and she was taught by these enlightened beings. When she started talking about this, some people, or a number of people, thought that Blavatsky was talking about these spirit guides, that they were dead people, that, similar to what the mediums knew about. But Blavatsky made a lot of emphasis, saying, no, these are actual human beings. They have physical bodies. They live in a house. They are yogis, but they have developed all the potentialities that are in human beings. Today we know also, for example, about, probably not with the Sanskrit word, but we know about the possibility of developing psychic and spiritual powers. In Sanskrit, they are called siddhis. And the yogis are able to develop, by a particular training, by meditation, are able to develop certain abilities that are not common for most humanity. They are able to, for example, perceive what other person is thinking or feeling. They are able to see things that are invisible for most human beings. We say they can see on a different plane. Sometimes it is called the astral plane or the mental plane. Or they are able to perceive things that are at the level of atoms, or perceive the universe. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali was a Hindu sage, and the Yoga Sutras is a description of the discipline of yoga. In these Yoga Sutras, there are many siddhis, many powers that are described. And as I said, today, some people, or a fair good amount of people, know about these siddhis. Back then, in Blavatsky's time, these siddhis were not known. In fact, one of the first things that she introduces when she writes Isis Unveiled, her first book, is the existence of these siddhis. So the idea is that these masters, in their process of evolution, develop all these siddhis, develop all these powers which may seem like a miracle for us, but they always said these are just normal powers that humanity has not learned how to develop, but that eventually every human being will develop in the course of evolution. The development of these powers may be accelerated by means that are safe and by means that are not safe, but this is another subject. The idea is that these Mahatmas or masters were enlightened beings, and they also had certain powers that can be developed by yogic techniques, and therefore they were with deep wisdom and with deep resources, deep abilities to do different things. Now there is one more concept that we have to introduce to understand the general idea of the masters. In Hinduism, the idea is that when one person gets enlightenment, it's usually liberated from the cycle of rebirth and is pretty much merged with the divine or with Parabrahman, with the ultimate reality, and that's it. There is the idea of the rishis. The rishis are like saints or enlightened beings in Hinduism, some of which remain alive, not necessarily in a physical body, but they remain alive in subtle bodies during the whole cycle of evolution, and they may remain available or stay available to help humanity. But this idea in Hinduism is not very developed. In Buddhism, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, they have the idea of the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is a person that gets to nirvana, or it's similar to enlightenment, but instead of entering in nirvana, which means disappearing, dissolving, and losing all possibility to be in touch with the conditioned realm, which is the physical plane, instead of merging in nirvana, they give up that state of spiritual realization so that they can keep in touch with the lower worlds. Let me explain this a little more. So it seems, Blavatsky says in The Voice of the Silence, that when a person gets to enlightenment, there are two paths, there are two options. Either the person gets merged with the divine or enters in nirvana, or the person gives up that state of absolute realization and retains the certain limitations so that these beings can keep in touch with humanity. So they give up nirvana and they keep in touch with the lower worlds, which means a huge sacrifice, because nirvana or liberation means the perfect bliss and perfection and truth and absolute consciousness. And giving up that means to remain in the realm of limitations, suffering, and conditioning. And why do they do that? The bodhisattvas give up the nirvana because they say, I cannot go into this state of absolute bliss, knowing that there are some other human beings that are in suffering. Probably just like a mother couldn't go in an eternal vacation, knowing that her kids are left behind and they need her. So the bodhisattva, in a similar way, knows that humanity needs help, that humanity needs to be liberated from this suffering. So he says, I cannot enjoy this absolute bliss, knowing that humanity, which is part of me, is still in suffering. So the Theosophical Mahatmas, they are this kind of bodhisattvas. They are enlightened beings. They have developed these psychic powers and spiritual powers, which are different psychic and spiritual powers. But they have developed all the potentialities of human beings, and they give up this absolute bliss to remain in touch with humanity and help us. When Blavatsky was talking about this, in the West, almost anybody knew about this bodhisattva ideal, which is fully developed in Tibet, in Tibetan Buddhism. It is present in the whole Mahayana Buddhism, which is in China, in India, there is a little of Mahayana Buddhism, and in some other places, in Japan. But in these countries, the idea of the bodhisattva, especially at that time, wasn't really known and developed, as I said, especially in the West. In Tibetan Buddhism, they have a strong tradition of the bodhisattvas. So when Blavatsky talked about this giving up nirvana, again, the scholars of the time, they said that Blavatsky was making things up and that these theosophists are inventing things. But later, with when the Tibetan teachings became available and the Tibetan lamas came to the West after China invaded Tibet, then they realized that what Blavatsky was talking about was true, that she really had not invented this idea of the bodhisattva. Still, in the teachings that we find in Buddhism, as far as I am aware of, there are not many descriptions about how these bodhisattvas help humanity. Some of them, there are stories of bodhisattvas appearing to earnest lamas and giving teachings. And then these lamas spread those teachings. So they said, Padmasambhava gave me these teachings and I'm spreading this. So the Tibetan Buddhism evolves and incorporates more teachings that didn't come necessarily from the Buddha, but the teachings came from different bodhisattvas that appeared to these lamas and taught them whatever humanity needed at that time. So this is more or less the basic idea of a master. It's an enlightened being. He retains the physical body, but since he could develop all the potentialities of human beings, he's able to communicate with people without being necessarily there physically. There are several means to communicate to some people. It could be through clairaudience, that means to hearing the voice of the master, or it could be through on the astral plane if the person is clairvoyant. I don't want to enter into too many details in this, because each one of these things that I am mentioning are a whole talk in itself. But the idea is that the masters have physical body and yet are not limited to their physical environment. And these masters remain with humanity because they are working to help in human evolution. They are the result of our human evolution. Most of us will, at the end of our cycle of evolution, will reach that state or that stage of what we call Mahatma or Master. But for the time being, from the theosophical point of view, we are more or less halfway through our cycle of evolution, and we are in the midst of suffering and conflict and problems, as we all are aware of. And these masters are trying to help us grow and discover truth. Now, how do they help? They have there is in the theosophical literature, there are some hints about what they do. Usually when Blavatsky would talk about this, she used to say that it is really difficult to understand what a master or a Mahatma does, because they mainly work on the spiritual planes, and none of us has a real knowledge of those planes. So it's like trying to explain to a kid, a small child, what we do at work. We can say some things, but he has not the experience, the knowledge, the maturity to understand what we really do. So he probably thinks that it's a kind of game, a kind of playing, a way of playing, because that's his reality. So when we try to understand what the masters are, what they do, we have more or less the same limitations. We try to figure this out with our elements, and probably our conception, our understanding is limited. And we have to be aware of this, because, you know, there is this saying, God made humans in his image, and ever since humans are repaying the favor to God, because we then make God to our image. So we have to be careful not to project our limitations onto the idea of the masters or the Mahatmas. So, but one of the functions that is easy to understand they have is to incarnate here and there as religious teachers. So in the theosophical view, it is said that Krishna, Buddha, Jesus, and many other sages in the world are these Mahatmas that took a public work, let's say, because since they work on the spiritual planes, they live in a kind of retirement or retreat. They are not in the midst of our society. There are several things that are important here to understand. Blavatsky once said that whatever we do on the spiritual planes has a deeper effect than whatever we do on the physical plane. So if we can help on the spiritual plane, that produces, as I said, a deeper effect in humanity than if we were working just on the physical plane. In a sense, we can see, we can give food to a person that needs it, but if we can, instead of giving something physical, we can give something at the level of skills, and we can teach this person how to develop a skill and to get a job, we are helping much more this person than by merely giving food. So the adepts work mainly on the spiritual planes, trying to help with the evolution of our soul. And as our soul evolves, then our physical consciousness will be free from conflicts and from suffering and will realize truth. If they, on the contrary, work on the physical plane and at the physical level, then it is much more difficult to grasp the spiritual truth than if they can do it on the spiritual planes. Now, how they help on the spiritual planes, we don't know. It's not that I don't think they are there on the spiritual planes teaching as we teach on the physical planes. This is what I was talking about, not projecting our limitations. They nourish in some way our souls to help, just like we help a baby, but we don't know how they really do it. However, from time to time, they come to the physical plane to try to impart religious teachings which will be, will set the right conditions for our spiritual development. So it is necessary, certain work on the physical plane is necessary, but it's not the main work that they do. Another way they help is inspiring and trying to strengthen every spiritual organization or every spiritual activity that anybody in humanity begins. Where a government may have a good idea that really helps or will help humanity or the country, and they may inspire that, they may try to help for that project or that idea to develop. So they try to inspire politicians, scientists, normal people. They try to encourage in everybody a spiritual development, spiritual ideas, spiritual intentions. Now, of course, the work team is, I'm sure, going to develop all this in detail. Of course, they work limited by the karma, by the law of karma. They cannot come and transform the world. They are not like gods that could do anything they want. In fact, they say that kind of God doesn't exist. There is no a God that could break the natural laws. They say nobody can break the natural laws. The natural laws are the divinity. And we, with all our development, can never break these natural laws. So within the natural laws, we try to help humanity as much as it is possible. So they help by, as I said, by incarnating as religious teachers. They help by trying to inspire everything that is good in humanity. They help on the spiritual planes, trying to nourish our spiritual nature. And some of them also, when there are really special people in the world, special from a spiritual point of view, when there are people who are devoid of a sense of selfishness, when there are people who are willing to help humanity, that have compassion in their hearts, that have developed their spirituality to a point where they realize that it is not right to spend all our energy, our money, our resources in getting a comfortable personal life. These people begin to see that they can help others in whatever area of their life. Some may be teachers, some may be householders, some may be scientists, some, in whatever field of life, wherever there is a person that is really spiritual, they may put a special attention on these people and try to encourage this developing spirituality in a special way. It's like if you are in a garden and you see a flower that is different from the rest, you may different in the spiritual sense, in the sense that could become a help to humanity. But coming back to the metaphor, if you see a flower that is special, you may put more attention and energy to nourish this flower. So in the same way, whenever there are people who can become a help, who can help humanity also, they may help this person to become a helper. Because remember always that their main aim, or the main reason why they didn't go into this nirvana, into this liberation, is because they want to help humanity. So they will place their attention on people who are helping humanity. They are not a kind of God that will go and give personal things to whoever believes in this God. They are not beings that are interested in giving personal things to a particular person. They are interested in people who may become helpers of humanity, which is what they do. And eventually, when a person is evolved enough, when a person has developed enough virtues and spiritual maturity and wisdom and compassion, and this person is fit to undertake a special training, they may get in touch with this particular person on the inner planes to help in the last stages of the spiritual evolution. And they help this person in the last stages so that this person becomes faster a Mahatma, so that this person can help humanity faster. So the idea is that they will train or get in touch with a person when the person is, as I said, fairly close to the end of human evolution, and only if this person is willing to be a helper of nature and a helper of humanity. When you see the theosophical literature, there is a description of what the qualities of these kind of people are, and these are very spiritual people, very unselfish people, people that are already doing something for the world. Now, there is the concept today of the ascended masters in some schools of the New Age, which claim to be the same as the theosophical masters or the theosophical Mahatmas. But really, if we compare the teachings that the masters gave through the Theosophical Society and the teachings that they are supposed to be given through usually through channeling, we can see that these two ideas of masters are completely different. And we are going to have in the next issue of our Theosophical Journey, the journal, The Quest, will be devoted to this subject of the Mahatmas. And there will be articles comparing these teachings and explaining further what a master or a Mahatma is. But what I wanted to point out is that it is interesting to study the idea, the theosophical idea and the New Age idea, and each person try to determine how much they resemble each other and which one they feel attracted to. Because in some aspects, the ascended masters have some features that many people think are not very easy to believe. So it's good to compare, and then you can make up your mind what you think about that. But already during Blavatsky's time, when the Mahatmas were in touch with some theosophies through this physical correspondence that, as I said at the beginning, the letters are kept in the British Library. They were before in the British Museum because they are remarkable letters. During the Blavatsky time, there were already some mediums that were saying that the masters, the theosophical masters, were communicating through them. So repeatedly, Blavatsky and the Mahatmas themselves had to say that they were not really communicating through these mediums. That they said, this person is saying that he was in touch with me, one of the masters said, and I can assure you that I wasn't in touch with that medium. He was writing to one English theosophist. And they explained that the astral plane, or the invisible world, is full of entities, all kinds of entities. Some of them are really people who have died, and they are on the astral plane, which is an intermediate plane between the spiritual world and the physical world. So there we have some people that are going through that intermediate state. And there are also what in theosophy is called elementals, which are a kind of invisible kingdom in nature, which are able to impersonate whatever is in our minds. So already during Blavatsky's times, there was this problem with different entities impersonating the masters. So whenever we study this question of the masters, we have to have certain discernment. It's not that everything that is claimed to come from the masters necessarily comes from the masters. So just as a warning, because if a person doesn't know about this and believes that everything that is claimed to come from the masters come from them, may see some things that are difficult to believe that could come from enlightened beings. So as the Theosophical Society, one of the bases is the freedom of thought. The Theosophical Society doesn't say this is a sanctioned teaching and accepted master and this communication is not accepted. Each one of us has to determine that. And it's one of our aims is to do an open-minded inquiry, which has two aspects. The open-minded aspect in the sense that we have to examine different things, and the inquiry aspect, we have to think and critically try to determine what is truth and what is not truth. Because open-minded doesn't mean just to accept everything that is out there. Open-minded is to be ready to examine everything. And inquiry is what brings the process of trying to discern truth. So I think more or less this could be a good foundation for what Tim is going to develop in the next series. He's going to talk about what the masters, or who the masters are, based on what they explained they are through these Mahatma letters that I was talking about. So now we could open up some space for question and answers. As we had the blizzard here, we don't have many physical people here, but we have probably virtual people out there. So you are welcome to send your questions through the internet also.
One of the questions I had, a lot of people sometimes think that when you talk about a Mahatma or an ascended master or someone like that, people project, as you suggest, and think of them as kind of like gods or perfect. And yet there's been many people expressing the notion that they're not perfect in the sense that we think of them as perfect. Could you tell us a little bit about this notion that they're human beings as well, and have to they sort of have limitations when they're on this plane?
Yes, I think Tim is going to talk about that, because that was one of the points that the Mahatmas really wanted to make through the correspondence that they were having with some theosophists. They say, we are not gods, and our superiors are neither, they hope. And they were really against this idea. They were against two ideas. Against the idea that they were spirit guides, like the entities that the mediums were communicating to. So they said, we are human beings. We have physical body, we have to eat, we have to take care of our bodies, we have houses, but we live in a retreat because we work on the spiritual planes, mainly through meditation. So the atmosphere in the cities, where there is so much energy going on the lower planes, because all our thoughts and emotions are actually energy. It's like noise. It's like if you want to hear something that is subtle, where you are in the midst of a lot of noise. You may be able to do it, but why would you expose yourself to be, in this noise, if you can go to a place that is quiet? So the masters usually live in retreats where they can devote to their work on the spiritual planes without being disturbed. Imagine that if we had or every more or less remarkable person that we had in the world attracted a lot of attention and the press and followers, and the followers asking all kinds of things. So actually a person like that is engaged in a public work have little time to work on the inner planes in meditation. So this is why they are retired from the world, but they said we have physical bodies. So that was one of the ideas. They are not spirits. And the other idea is that they have limitations. They said everything that has a body, that has a form, has a limitation in itself. Having a body means that, and when you are working through the body, means that you are working through the limitations of the body. So they said, when we are in a state of meditation and our consciousness is centered on the highest spiritual plane, we may be perfect, so to say, relatively speaking. If you, within the range of spiritual evolution, human spiritual evolution, they had gotten to the maximum spiritual evolution that is possible at this time. But they say, as soon as we withdraw our consciousness from the spiritual planes, then we are people that may make mistakes, that are within limitations. Of course, they remain very wise people if you compare them with us, but still they are under a lot of limitations. And they used to say, we are not gods, because the human tendency is to say, okay, God is very removed. We have these beings that are or seem to be closer, so let us take these beings as gods. And that's what has happened in several movements after the TS started talking about these beings. So some people tend to think that the masters are gods hanging out on the astral plane, and that they can pray to them, and that when they have difficulties they can say, send rain for my crop, or send me a car or a job. And this actually happens, and this happened already during Blavatsky's times. And Blavatsky sent a letter to some theosophists at that time saying, you have no idea what you are doing. You are desecrating the sacredness of the idea of a master by asking personal things. Do you think that the master cares about your world of shadows and your limited desires. The masters care only about your spiritual aspirations and what you do for humanity. But they are not gods. They are to, like the lamp of the Geni, to ask for desires. So they were very emphatical in this idea that they are not gods, and that they are impersonal, and that they are at the same time limited. As I said, I'm pretty sure Tim is going to talk about that, because that's one of the main points that they made. Some other idea is that the relationship between a master and a disciple is a very particular relationship, which is difficult to understand. Usually the idea that we have in the relationship of a teacher and a student is that the teacher will be there guiding the student and giving information and, taking care of this, like if it were the father or mother. But these adepts, they get in touch with people that are already, in a sense, leaders, not necessarily well known, in the sense that they are not followers. They are people that produce things. They are people that don't need to be guided or taken by their hands and say, do this, do that, don't do that. It's like the masters are like, if we had Einstein, the knowledge that he has is very important for people who have a deep knowledge in physics, for example. So these people that have a deep knowledge in physics could profit from Einstein's teachings. Now, what would you think if Einstein, instead of publishing or developing the theory of relativity, and instead of teaching in the university to these high learned students, if he would waste his time by teaching in elementary school, just because he loves kids? So he goes there and he teaches them 1 + 1 = 2, and then you have 2 apples if So the masters are not beings or human beings that are going to waste their time teaching things that are out there in all the religions that any of us can also share. Many times when you see some of the messages that come through some channelings, they are very basic messages that any member of the Theosophical Society could give something, deeper. And it's difficult to believe that the masters would waste their time in giving this kind of instructions. When you see what they wrote in the Mahatma letters, those are teachings that are deeply philosophical, very difficult to grasp, because the idea is that they appeal to our spiritual nature. They try to help us develop the spiritual nature. So everything else, we can learn it from books, we can learn it from each other. But with these disciples, they don't even teach at the level of information. If you see what Blavatsky describes, she says, nothing of everything that I learned and I write down was taught to me by means of a verbal or written teaching. Nobody came and told me, okay, this is like this. I learned everything by meditation on the inner planes. So what the masters do with the disciples, they teach them how to reach truth by their own means. They don't teach information. What they did in the Mahatma letters, they said, this is an extraordinary thing that we are doing, trying to teach information to to these theosophists, and one of the Mahatmas says, and my fellow beings here, they think that I got nut, I went nut, and something like that. He uses a kind of slang language. He says they think I'm crazy trying to teach you in this way, because spiritual knowledge cannot be given through any kind of teaching like this. Spiritual knowledge can be absorbed by the person on the spiritual planes, by personal experience. And there are many quotes like this in the letters that probably Tim is going to talk about. So the relationship between the master and the disciple is a very particular one. When they asked Blavatsky to found the Theosophical Society, they didn't tell her how to do it. They just said, we want you to form an organization to fight against superstition and to spread the idea of brotherhood. And Blavatsky says, how to do it, everything was left to me. I didn't have the master to ask him, how should I do it? Do you think that this is good? So the masters really are not constantly teaching the person, are not constantly guiding. Otherwise, it would be an annoyance. The master would have to be constantly paying attention to this person and couldn't do the work on the inner planes. So that's something to keep in mind.
So why do you think that the masters invested so much energy in writing these letters? And then if they invested that much energy, why did they stop?
Mm-hmm. They say in one of the letters to Sinet, this wasn't really planned. You started asking a few questions, and I thought that it was a good opportunity to prove to the world that we existed. So I went and asked permission to a higher adept if I could do this. Reluctantly, it seems that this higher adept said, okay, you can try. And then these questions generated more questions, and the master saw that there was a possibility of Sinet could use these teachings to write a book. Because so far the only book on theosophy that was there was Isis Unveiled, which didn't really give much information. Blavatsky was trying to open the eyes of the West to certain things that we didn't know, like the psychic powers and things, because science at that time thought that they had everything figured out. So Blavatsky wanted to say, okay, how do we explain this? It was just to try to open the eyes of the West. So the Mahatmas thought Sinet was a very intelligent person, a very influential person. He was the editor of the most important newspaper in India. He was British. And the master said, okay, if we are investing this time in teaching you, you have to write a book or something that can benefit many other people. We don't do things for particular persons, So Sinet accepted, and actually he wrote a couple of books out of that. And the master said that one of the aims that they had at that time is to prove the world that they existed. Because in the East, the idea of the masters was more or less there. Not, as I said at the beginning, it wasn't really fully developed, but every Hindu knew about the rishis. Almost every Buddhist knew about the bodhisattvas or the arhats. But in the West, we had lost completely the idea of the masters. And they said that they wanted to bring back to the West the knowledge that there was something like the masters, not because they wanted self-promotion. On the contrary, they are constantly saying that they don't want people to worship them, that they don't want to prove to the world without any doubt that they exist. They don't want any of that, but they wanted the ideal of the master to be a spiritual inspiration. It's a strong spiritual inspiration if we know that the master is within us, if we know that we have the potentiality to become a master. So it seems, out of what they write there, that they try to maintain this correspondence for a while for these purposes, to prove to the world that they existed, to encourage Sinet to write a couple of books and spread the theosophical teachings. And they say in one of the letters, we are doing this, we are breaking the silence of the centuries, because this is a particular cycle in humanity. At this point, humanity was closing a spiritual cycle and opening a new one. And the Master said, if we can push humanity towards spirituality at the commencement of this new cycle, then this will be very beneficial to humanity. So this is one of the ways they help in human evolution. So they said, we will correspond with you for a few years until this cycle, the old cycle gets to the end, and as long as Blavatsky is there, because these letters were sent psychically through Blavatsky. Not that Blavatsky was channeling them. Blavatsky was being used to precipitate the letters, as they said, to materialize the letters. There are many yogis in India that they can do similar things. You know, even Sai Baba is said to be able to materialize a kind of powder. And there are yogis that are able to do that. That power is known in India. So what they did is, using Blavatsky's psychic energy, they were materializing the letters. And they said, if we don't have a disciple there that can be this bridge, you know, we cannot precipitate the letters. Or we could, but that would involve a lot of energy that is not worth spending. So in the letters themselves, we can see that the Master said, this is only for a short time. This is an extraordinary measure that we never did in the past. I mean the letters. You know, in the past they always communicated with disciples that were evolved enough. So that's what I think we can get from the letters.
We have a question from the internet. Marina writes, you have mentioned tonight the term spiritual planes and inner planes, where the work of the Masters mostly takes place. Could you describe what is meant by inner planes in this context and give some examples of how we can be aligned with and working with these influences?
Mm-hmm. Well, by inner planes I mean all non-physical planes. Now, these non-physical planes, according to the theosophical view, the universe has many dimensions. We used to call them planes. One is a physical plane or dimension, but there is also an emotional plane, sometimes it's called astral plane, which is the emotional dimension is where our emotions become actions. You know, you can contact a person, and even without knowing this person, if you are sensitive, you can feel many times how the person is. Or many times you feel how an environment is. How does that happen? It's because there is a dimension in the universe where emotions are things, are an energy that can be perceived. So we have the physical body and we have an emotional body, which is part of what people usually call the aura. So there is this emotional body, emotional plane, which is an inner plane, in the sense that, you know, the idea is that reality is at the core of the universe, and then we have planes that, as they go away from reality, outside, so to say, these are just images, they become denser and denser until we get to the physical plane. So we have the emotional plane and we have also a mental plane through which thoughts can be sent and perceived. And then above that, we have some other planes which are spiritual. Because it's spiritual in the sense that we have a physical body, we have emotions, we have a mind, and our emotions, our mind, our physical body can be used to do good and to do wrong things. So the planes that are above the emotional plane and the mental plane are planes where evil cannot enter, where are planes where the perception of unity prevails. So this is why I following the theosophical teachings, call them spiritual planes. So inner planes would be all non-physical planes, and spiritual planes would be those that are beyond the possibility of selfishness or, aggression. And every time that as we live, we naturally act on the emotional, mental, and physical plane. But as we do things that have to do with compassion, love, harmony, with the general good, we are actually acting on the spiritual planes, or from the spiritual planes. Obviously, we are acting on the physical plane, but the origin of our action comes from the spiritual planes, from a spiritual perception, every time that we do something good. So the idea is that every time we are impersonal, that we have compassion and all these spiritual virtues that we all heard about, we are acting from the spiritual planes.